Remember when Star Wars stories were able to stand on their own 2 feet without having to tell a different story to distract you from the supposed main event? It's honestly sad to look at the level of storytelling on display now, with a lot of this coming to a head in the Book of Boba Fett. We've reached the point where a show allegedly about him decides to go 2 episodes without him contributing in any meaningful way, assuming he even shows up. So why exactly am I making a video to point this out when I haven't talked about a Star Wars TV show in years? Because this is a problem that has been in the back of my mind ever since The Mandalorian Season 2, and arguably even before that. When debating whether to talk about The Bad Batch, one of the main points in my script was the sheer volume of times when a prior character shows back up, which is something that hasn't slowed down. To some extent, you could perhaps see this as a positive. The fact that new and old characters can interact with each other in a meaningful way, as has been done many times in the expanded universe. Whether it be Mara Jade showing up in an expansion to Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, or many a character having a significant influence in Empire at War, this isn't anything new. And yet, over the last few years, there's been a marked difference in how those cameos are handled. Not only have there been a hell of a lot more of them within a particular product, with stories like EA Battlefront 2 and The Mandalorian Season 2 being packed to the gills with them, the callbacks are such that they're drowning out the stories being told in the moment. In the case of the former, the marketing sold the game as being a chance to finally get to play as the Empire for the first time in a very long time. Only for us to spend half the game playing as characters who are not part of Inferno Squad, with the supposed main characters breaking ranks before the halfway mark with very little time spent actually processing the decision. As for The Mandalorian, one of the first season's strengths was that it was a largely disconnected story from the rest of the universe. Sure, there were Mandalorians, bounty hunters, and fledgling Jedi, but by being disconnected from the whole, it does a solid job at giving a sense of this larger world, that there's more going on than just the Skywalker saga. Also, with it being a live-action TV show, it would be some people's first introduction to Mandalorian culture. So while the show definitely has its issues, it's easy enough to get into. However, the moment you start contrasting the main character with other established characters, you start to realize how little characterization he gets. The point of keeping the helmet on and saying very little was to create this sense of mystery. But when you throw in a ton of established characters like Ahsoka, Boba Fett, and Luke Skywalker, it leads to him being overshadowed in his own show. Having all of these cameos and callbacks can also lead the universe to feel smaller overall, which was a major issue for The Bad Batch. The series premiere was a promising start, with us following a special bunch of clone troopers who defect from the Empire. But over the course of their meandering adventure, they're forced into one random event after another where they somehow meet up with half of Phoenix Squadron, the Rancor underneath Jabba's palace, the worst part of the Clone Wars Season 7, a bunch of other named clone troopers, and significant figures within the Empire and Rebellion. It isn't clear as to how much time passes within the first season, but considering they eventually end up having a place they keep coming back to, running into so many familiar faces within a world as big as a galaxy is insanely unlikely. In fact, there was even a prelude to what the Book of Boba Fett would end up doing within The Bad Batch. Not because Boba shows up, but because one of the best episodes ended up being the one that had the least to do with the main characters. In that episode, they spend a significant amount of time showing how Ryloth is dealing with the newly declared Empire, with a lot of time spent on the Syndulla family we've seen in both the Clone Wars and Rebels. However, the Bad Batch only show up for a minute or two as glorified delivery men, with this being used as a springboard to further involve them in Ryloth's affairs the following episode. When you have to go to pre-established characters to tell a story that ends up being more interesting than the one the main characters are on, what does that say about the story being told with them and our investment in that tale? All of this leading up to the most insulting low of all, the fact that this exact pattern happens not to an original character, but to Boba Fett. With very little dialogue and exposition, The Empire Strikes Back makes an intriguing character who was clever enough to see through Han's ruse, was able to track them to Bespin, and who looked really cool on top of that. The cool factor was undermined when he got dropped in the Sarlacc pit, but on that basis, there was plenty that could and was done with the character in future material, with him regularly showing up as a bad guy or playable character in games like Dark Forces and Empire at War. And yet, what could have been a really interesting crime thriller, with proper build-up for why the Pike Syndicate is such a danger to Boba's ambitions, and with a ton of work put in to prepare for them, we instead spend it on member berries that are entirely disconnected from that central thread. Episode 5 gives us one interjection from Fennec, and then Episode 6 spends a lot of meandering with Luke and Grogu before finally getting back on topic. And even then we spend more time with previously established characters than the main cast. The reason why this is a problem is because we've reached a point where a viewer is now mandated to watch The Mandalorian if they want to understand what's happening. If your only context for The Mandalorian are the films, you can follow along. Even if you haven't seen the Clone Wars, you could even follow along with the Bad Batch, as the characterization for people like the Syndulla family is good enough that you don't necessarily need to know where they've shown up previously. This is a pattern that has been broken with the Book of Boba Fett, as if you haven't watched The Mandalorian, neither of these episodes will make sense. In fact, I would have much preferred if these two episodes were released as a film or as a season 2.5 of The Mandalorian, completely separate to the Book of Boba Fett. That way, they don't needlessly distract from the main thread, and the people who like it can still enjoy it as it exists. Speaking of which, what further frustrates me is that while I might understand some of the praise they're getting, it seems the only reason that praise exists is because The Last Jedi has lowered our standards so much that we're just happy to see familiar faces. For the sake of cheap member berries, we've completely thrown logic out the window, which led to a story that won't hold up to scrutiny in the long run. The reason why Mando wanted a replacement for the Razor Crest wasn't just because he needed any old ship, but because he needed something with cargo space to transport goods and people, not to mention a place where he could live. A starfighter might be fine if you're a lone character going a short distance with an astromech to help you out, but unless he gets something with a cargo hold, a one-seat ship will severely hamstring the kind of jobs he can accept as a bounty hunter. The way that the Darksaber works also doesn't logically follow from how it's been shown elsewhere, as while it's stated that your will has an effect on the blade, why have we never seen this particular effect for any kind of lightsaber before now? Even when Sabine was dealing with some serious inner turmoil while training with the exact same blade. It feels like the writers didn't want a carbon copy of that scene, so they modified the way the description is given without any care for what their alterations were implying. Moving on to episode 6, you took the most interesting conversation that could have happened between Luke and Ahsoka, comparing the Obi-Wan and Anakin that each of them knew, and you either had it off screen or didn't have it at all. That is the main reason why we would want those two characters to interact, to contrast a former member of the old guard to a new generation who saw a very different side to that old guard. And yet there's no substantial discussion of that. Did you learn nothing when people were upset that you didn't show Luke's reaction to Han's death in The Last Jedi? Are you so worried about the Ahsoka show performing well that you'd waste their first on-screen encounter on a scene full of dead air? And worst of all, why are Ahsoka and Luke the last two people you'd expect to support the no attachment rule, then saying that Grogu needs to follow it? You already have ready-made arguments that can be lifted whole cloth from Knights of the Old Republic, with characters who would have good reason not to follow it after seeing how needing to hide his marriage isolated Anakin and left him vulnerable to manipulation, with an emotional attachment being literally the only reason Luke is even alive right now. And yet because Grogu is a big reason why people like The Mandalorian, we have to contrive a reason for him to get back to Mando, even if it leads to Luke being character assassinated again. What's really upsetting about this is that we have a very recent example of how you do callbacks and cameos properly. Of someone taking an existing world and making a stellar character-driven narrative where the overwhelming majority of the character's actions and behavior logically follows. A show that transcends the medium it sprung from to become one of the best TV shows I've ever seen. What's even more pathetic is that the stellar example I'm talking about is an adaptation of League of Legends, a competitive multiplayer game whose only job is to sell you on a character's moveset and maybe their personality. And yet it managed to handle its callbacks and prior characters with more finesse, grace, and dignity than modern Star Wars could ever hope to achieve. And they did it by focusing on the story at hand, showing us the characters as they grow up, fleshing out their motivations, naturally integrating the quirks and equipment they have from the game. All of them realistically interacting with each other to create some stellar payoffs, so much so that you don't need to understand anything about the game to enjoy it. They weren't concerned about a million different projects that all have to come out on a specific timetable. They weren't concerned with generating content, they were focused on telling a story. And that seems to be the fatal flaw of Star Wars right now. This massive schedule suggests to me that too much time is being spent on padding content for Disney Plus and building up to a climactic moment that might be good, with very little care being taken for the individual stories. It's like I'm watching a YouTube channel that has a daily schedule to fulfill but has run out of ideas and is just mindlessly treading water. All while everyone involved becomes jaded by the lack of enthusiasm. If this is how every Star Wars show is going to be, then I have no interest in seeing where the threads lead. I will still explore the expanded universe, as that's a well that I've yet to fully tap, but the Disney canon no longer interests me, and I doubt that the upcoming video games will be able to sway me either. They may be fun from a gameplay standpoint, but if they treat beloved characters like Luke and Ahsoka this haphazardly, I have no faith in their ability to tell interesting stories with anyone else, even if their only job is to remake something that's already good.